In a low-lit Harlem back room, a decorated Navy SEAL laughed, called Bumpy Johnson bones, and dared him to fight a real man. To the ceiling like it had nowhere else to go, and the low bulbs threw tired shadows across card tables and folded coats. 8 men stood or sat close enough to feel each other breathe. No music played. No one joked. Bumpy Johnson stood near the back, his coat open, his posture relaxed in a way that made strangers uneasy. He had the stillness of someone who didn't need to announce himself. A Navy man leaned against the wall like he owned it. Broad shoulders, thick neck, and scarred in a way that spoke of discipline and damage. He had already told stories no one asked for, ports he'd seen, men he'd buried, fights that ended before they started. Each word was louder than the last. He wanted the room to know what he was. The men let him talk, because sometimes letting a man speak was the fastest way to learn what he didn't understand. The laugh broke out sharp and sudden. It cut across the room and didn't bother apologizing. The Navy man's eyes landed on Bumpy like he'd finally noticed him. "That's him," he said, half smiling. "That's the bones everyone whispers about?" No one answered. Silence. Pressed in. The insult didn't rush. It hung there, waiting to see who would claim it. Bumpy didn't move. He didn't correct the man. He didn't look away either. His eyes stayed calm, focused, almost curious. He'd seen men like this before, men trained to believe size and scars were the same thing as authority. Men who mistook quiet for fear. Around them, chairs creaked softly as bodies shifted. The room felt smaller. Everyone understood what kind of moment this was becoming. The Navy man straightened, feeding off the quiet. "I've fought real men," he said, voice rising just enough to challenge the walls. "Men who don't hide behind reputations." He looked Bumpy up and down again, slower this time. "If you want respect, fight a real man." The words landed hard, deliberate. A dare, dressed up as truth. One of the witnesses swallowed. Another glanced toward the door, calculating distance. Nobody interrupted. In Harlem, interruption was a language of its own, and Bumpy hadn't spoken it yet. He rested one hand lightly on the table beside him, fingers spread, steady. He was measuring the room who belonged, who might be endangered, who needed protection when this was over. The insult wasn't just personal. Everyone felt that. The Navy man didn't know it, but he had challenged a balance that took years to build. Bumpy's authority wasn't muscle. It was order. It was knowing which grocer stayed open late so kids could eat, which preacher needed help keeping the lights on, which arguments never needed to turn violent because everyone already understood the outcome. That was what stood behind him now. Quiet and unspoken death, the Navy man mistook the silence for permission. He stepped closer, boots heavy on the floor. "What's wrong?" he said. "Cat got your tongue?" His breath carried whiskey and confidence. The room tightened further. 8 witnesses felt the expectation settle into their bones. This was how blood started. This was how stories went wrong. Bumpy finally shifted his weight. Not forward, not back. Just enough to show he was present. His voice, when it came, was low and even. "You traveled far to speak like that," he said. No anger in it, no challenge. Just fact. The words didn't rise. They didn't need to. They carried weight because they were chosen. The Navy man frowned, confused by the lack of heat. He wanted sparks. He wanted fists. He wanted a clean story where strength answered strength. Instead, he found himself standing in a room that had gone very still, facing a man who hadn't given him what he came for. The witnesses felt it then, the shift from noise to consequence. Bumpy's eyes held the Navy man's without strain. "This isn't a ring," he said softly. Not loud, just clear. Everyone understood what side they stood on, even if the Navy man didn't yet. The moment stretched. 8 witnesses breathed as one, waiting for the inevitable choice. Violence hovered close, close enough to taste. But Bumpy didn't rush it. He let inevitability do what it always did. He let the room remember who it belonged to. Harlem did. Not announce itself. It revealed who you were by how you moved through it. The streets outside the room carried their own memory brick walls that had promises broken and kept. Stoops worn smooth by generations of waiting, shop windows. That reflected men exactly as they were. Bumpy Johnson belonged to that memory. Not because he claimed it, but because it recognized him. Earlier that day, he had walked Lenox Avenue without hurry. Men tipped their hats without looking for approval. A butcher wrapped meat a little tighter than usual, knowing it would be eaten by a family that mattered. None of it was spoken. Authority that needed words wasn't authority at all. Real power stayed quiet and made the noise come to it. The Navy man hadn't seen any of that. He hadn't watched Bumpy settle disputes with a look or end arguments by standing still long enough for men to remember themselves. He didn't know how many boys stayed out of trouble because Bumpy expected more of them, or how many shopkeepers slept easier because certain lines were never crossed. To the outsider, Harlem looked like territory. To Bumpy, it was responsibility. Inside the room, the witnesses carried that understanding with them. Each man knew why he was there, and each knew why Bumpy mattered. Not because he was the strongest, but because he was the most restrained. Because when Bumpy acted, it was never for display. It was for balance. The Navy man shifted again, sensing something he couldn't name. He had faced enemy lines and learned to trust chaos. Harlem didn't work that way. Harlem remembered faces. It remembered who kept their word and who didn't. Bumpy stood as proof of that memory, steady and unremarkable to anyone who didn't know how to look. You hear me? The Navy man pressed, louder now, trying to pull heat from the room. I asked you something. His voice bounced off the walls and came back smaller. He didn't realize it, but he was already alone. Bumpy glanced around, not in search of support, but in acknowledgement of it. 8 witnesses, each connected to something larger than themselves. A barber who closed late, a driver who never talked, a cousin of a preacher. These weren't fighters, they were roots. And roots didn't bend for storms that passed through. This place runs on respect, Bumpy said, calm as ever. You speak careless, you borrow trouble. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He spoke the way men spoke when they were done measuring. The Navy man scoffed, but it came out. Thin. Respect's earned, he said. Out there, you earn it with your hands. He flexed without meaning to. Old habits. The witnesses watched Bumpy, not the muscles. They knew which one mattered. Bumpy nodded once. Here, he said, you earn it by keeping the peace. The sentence settled into the room. It wasn't a warning. It was a rule. The kind that existed long before the Navy man walked in and would exist long after he left. 2 men, both proud, both wrong. Bumpy had stood between them and asked a single question neither could answer without shame. The fight had died there. That was power. Not ending a life, but redirecting one. The Navy man paced a step, then another, testing the floor like it might give him answers. He was used to clear lines. Enemy, ally, target. Harlem offered none of that. It offered expectation. They didn't. Fear wasn't the currency here. Belonging was. Bumpy met his eyes again. I don't need to, he said. Authority returned to its place, not through force, but through recognition. But who would never abandon the man in front of them? Outside, a siren passed and faded. Life went on. Harlem continued to breathe. Inside, the moment matured. Bumpy didn't rush it. He let the outsider feel the difference between strength and dominance, between noise and command. What the Navy man didn't understand was simple. In Harlem, Bumpy Johnson wasn't a man you challenged. He was the line you learned not to cross. Pressure had a way of revealing men. Some folded quickly, some exploded. The rare ones absorbed it until it lost its shape. Bumpy Johnson belonged to that last kind. He understood that tension was only dangerous when it was rushed. Left alone, it told you everything you needed to know. The Navy man felt the room slipping from him and tried to reclaim it the only way he knew how, by pushing harder. He squared his shoulders, rolled his neck once, and let his eyes wander. Daring someone to challenge him. No one did. That unsettled him more than fists ever could. He was trained for resistance, not indifference. I've seen men twice his size break in seconds. They found neither. Their loyalty expressed through stillness. Bumpy watched the Navy man carefully, not as an opponent, but as a problem that needed solving without collateral damage. He saw pride sharpened by discipline, confidence hardened into arrogance. He also saw fatigue, the kind that came from carrying an identity that needed constant proving. That was the weakness. Not physical, human. You're not home, Bumpy. Said evenly, men forget themselves when they travel. The statement wasn't cruel. It was observant. It landed deeper than any insult because it was true. The Navy man turned fully now, face tight. You think I don't belong? Belonging mattered more than he wanted to admit. Bumpy shook his head once. It offered a way back without humiliation. The Navy man didn't take it. Pressure built like a held breath. One of the witnesses shifted his stance, ready to step in if needed, not to fight, but to shield. That was the kind of loyalty Bumpy inspired. Order over chaos. The Navy man took another step closer, crowding space. His shadow crossed Bumpy's chest. He wanted dominance to be visible, measurable. Bumpy didn't retreat. He didn't advance either. Size meant nothing when it had nowhere to go. I fought wars, the Navy man said. What have you done? It was the wrong question. Harlem didn't measure men by the places they'd been. It measured them by what they held together. Bumpy's gaze never wavered. I keep this place standing, he replied. The answer wasn't boastful. It was factual. The witnesses felt it settle like a cornerstone. They knew the truth of it in their bones. Rumors had already begun to move beyond the room. Word traveled fast in Harlem, faster when tension carried it. Somewhere nearby, men paused mid-conversation, sensing something turning. Pressure didn't stay contained for long. Bumpy understood that. Whatever happened here would echo. That was why restraint mattered. The Navy man laughed again, louder this time, but it sounded forced. You think these people would save you? He said, sweeping an arm toward the witnesses. They'd scatter the moment things got real. He believed fear was universal. He didn't understand loyalty forged over time. Bumpy finally raised his hand, not in threat, but in quiet command. The witnesses stilled further, if that was possible. They won't have to, he said. The words were simple. The implication wasn't. The Navy man hesitated, just a fraction. The outsider was realizing that this wasn't a test of strength, but of judgment. And he was failing it. You want to fight, Bumpy continued calmly, because that's the only language you trust. He paused, letting the sentence breathe. But fights end. Consequences don't. The room absorbed that truth. The Navy man felt it like a shift under his feet. He glanced toward the door. Again, calculating. Not escape, just options. There were fewer than before. Harlem had a way of closing ranks without moving an inch. Say it, the Navy man demanded, frustration leaking through. Say you're scared. He needed the admission. He needed the story to end the way he understood stories. Bumpy leaned. Slightly forward then, not enough to threaten, just enough to be unmistakable. His voice lowered, carried only to those who needed to hear it. "Fear keeps men alive," he said. "Pride gets them buried." The sentence was delivered without heat. It landed with weight. The witnesses felt the pressure crest. This was the point where mistakes were usually made, where ego reached for violence to protect itself. Bumpy didn't allow it. He was trapped between identities, the warrior he believed himself to be and the outsider he had become in this room. Pressure cracked something in him. Not enough to break, but enough to expose. "You don't get to talk to me like that," he said, voice low now. The bravado was fading. What remained was anger without direction. Bumpy straightened, reclaiming the space with posture alone. "Here," he said, "I do." It wasn't defiance. It was jurisdiction. The witnesses understood. So did the Navy man finally. The room went silent again. Pressure had done its work. The moment approached its turning point, shaped not by fists, but by patience. Bumpy Johnson stood exactly where he had been all along, at the center of gravity, while the storm realized it had nowhere to land. Public disrespect was a different animal. Private insults bruised pride. Public ones demanded a reckoning. Everyone in the room knew the difference, and so did Bumpy Johnson. He understood that when words crossed a certain line, silence alone could be mistaken for surrender. The trick was knowing when silence taught a lesson and when it invited more damage. The Navy man made his choice without realizing it. He turned slightly, enough to include the room, enough to make his next words travel. "This is who you follow?" he said, voice sharp, carrying. A quiet man hiding behind a neighborhood? The sentence wasn't meant for Bumpy anymore. It was meant for Harlem. The witnesses stiffened. That was the line. Not because it insulted Bumpy, but because it dismissed everything that held them together. Shops, families, names earned the slow way. Disrespect aimed outward always came back heavier. Bumpy felt it land. He didn't react right away. He let the words echo, let every man present feel the insult fully. Public disrespect required public clarity. Anything less would leave confusion behind, and confusion was dangerous. "You're speaking to people now," Bumpy said evenly. His voice carried just enough to be heard by everyone without rising. "Choose your words careful." It was an offer, a final one. The Navy man scoffed, nerves pushing him forward. "Or what?" he asked. The challenge was naked now. Violence waited close, eager. Bumpy stepped into the center of the room at last. Not fast, not slow, deliberate. The movement alone drew focus. He stood where everyone could see him clearly, where there would be no misunderstanding about who answered. "The insult. You came here loud," Bumpy said. "You leave here remembered." The sentence settled with a weight that quieted even the Navy man's breathing. This wasn't escalation. It was framing. Bumpy was deciding how the night would be understood. The Navy man laughed again, but it cracked halfway through. "You think reputation scares me?" he said. "I've buried men with bigger names." His eyes searched the room, daring someone to react. No one did. Harlem didn't respond to bait. It responded to decisions. Bumpy nodded once, as if acknowledging a point no one else could see. "Names don't make men," he said. "Men make names." The witnesses felt the truth of it. They had seen it lived, not spoken. The Navy man stepped closer again, invading space in front of everyone now. The insult had become a spectacle. This was the danger. If unchecked, it would demand violence to restore balance. Bumpy understood. A reckless response could shatter the very order he protected. He raised his hand again, palm open, not toward the Navy man, but toward the room. To remember. You came into a house, you. Don't know, Bumpy said, voice steady. You spoke over people who built it. His eyes never left the Navy man. That's the disrespect. The Navy man's jaw tightened. The room had shifted from confrontation to judgment. 8 witnesses weren't waiting for a fight anymore. They were watching a lesson. You want a real man? Bumpy continued. A real man knows when he's outmatched without touching a fist. The words cut deeper than any blow. They redefine the terms of strength in front of everyone. The Navy. Man's face flushed. Anger surged, but it had nowhere clean to go. Swinging now would prove Bumpy right. Backing down would mark him forever. Public disrespect had trapped him in a corner of his own making. For a long second, no one moved. Even the air felt held. This was the edge where stories split, one path soaked in blood, the other etched in memory. Bumpy took one more step forward, closing the distance just enough to be undeniable. His voice dropped, but it carried. You don't need to fight me, he said. You already lost the room. He glanced briefly at the witnesses, then back. That's public. The Navy. Man looked around again. This time he saw it. Not fear. They would remember restraint. And they would remember who broke it. His shoulders sagged a fraction. Pride fought reason, but reason finally spoke louder. The insult had failed to do what it was meant to do. It had elevated the man it tried to diminish. Bumpy stepped back, giving space without yielding ground. We're done here, he said. Not dismissal, closure, the kind that left no opening for argument. The Navy man hesitated, then turned away. Boots moved toward the door, heavier than before. The room stayed silent until it closed behind him. Only then did the witnesses breathe again. Bumpy remained standing, eyes thoughtful, already considering what the night would mean tomorrow. Public disrespect had been answered without spectacle. Order remained intact. Harlem had spoken through him, calmly, unmistakably. 8 witnesses would carry it forward. The door closed without a slam. That mattered. In Harlem, how a man left a room said more than how he entered it. The Navy man's boots faded down the hall, each step slower than the last, carrying a weight he hadn't brought with him. Inside, no one spoke. The climax had arrived not in collision, but in control. Bumpy Johnson stayed where he was, centered, breathing evenly. He didn't watch the door. He watched the men who remained. 8 witnesses stood in a quiet that felt deliberate now, chosen. They understood something had ended, even if nothing had broken. Calm domination wasn't about humiliation. It was about clarity. The outsider came looking for a fight and found a boundary instead. That boundary would travel farther than bruises ever could. One of the witnesses shifted, then stopped himself, as if unsure whether movement was allowed yet. Bumpy noticed. He lowered his hand slowly, signaling release. The room loosened by degrees. Order restored. Sit, Bumpy said softly. Not an order. An invitation back to normalcy. Chairs scraped. Cards were gathered. The ritual resumed because it had been tested and held. Someone poured a drink and slid it toward Bumpy without asking. He didn't touch it right away. He looked at the glass as if it were a marker, something to be considered. Power didn't rush celebration. What you did, one man began, then stopped. Words felt unnecessary. Bumpy glanced at him, a feint, not acknowledging the effort. We did, he said. He never carried victory alone. Community was the point. Outside, the Navy man paused on the stoop, unseen by those inside. The city noise returned around him, cars, voices, a distant horn. Harlem went on. He realized then what had unsettled him most. Not the absence of violence, but the presence of belonging he couldn't penetrate. Strength had rules here. and he had broken them without knowing they existed. Back inside, Bumpy finally lifted the glass, took a small sip, and set it down. "No stories," he said quietly. "No chasing." His gaze moved across the room, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "Tonight ends here." That was domination deciding what would not happen. The men nodded. They understood the discipline required to keep a victory clean. Gossip inflated moments into legends that invited challenge. Bumpy preferred inevitability to myth. Silence settled again, but this time it was different. It was the calm after alignment, not tension. 8 witnesses
felt steadier than when they'd arrived.
They would remember the posture, the timing, the way strength had been expressed without spectacle. Bumpy leaned back against the table, weight resting easy. He thought of the boys who would hear pieces of this story later, stripped of drama, delivered as guidance. He thought of shopkeepers opening their doors tomorrow, confident nothing had shifted. He thought of the lesson carried by the man who left, how real power corrected without needing to prove itself. Calm domination meant the room was still a room, not a battleground. It meant no blood to clean, no names to hide, no families to console. It meant the line held. Someone laughed softly then, relieved, almost surprised. Bumpy allowed it. Life returned in increments. That too was part of command, knowing when to let the world breathe again. He stood once more, adjusting his coat. "I'll walk," he said. Another signal. The night was done. The men gathered their things, opening the door for him without ceremony. Respect didn't announce itself. On the street, the air felt cooler. Harlem lights reflected off windows like watchful eyes. Bumpy moved through them unchallenged, not because he demanded it, but because he earned it daily. Calm domination followed him, invisible and absolute. 8 witnesses watched him go, understanding they'd seen something rare, not a fight one, but a standard set. The kind that lasted. Morning came without headlines. That was how Bumpy Johnson preferred it. Harlem woke the same way it always did, keys turning in shop doors, brooms brushing sidewalks, children cutting corners on their way to school. The night before didn't announce itself, but it lived quietly in the way men nodded, in how conversations paused and then continued with confidence. Word moved carefully, not the Navy man's version, not a story sharpened for drama, just the truth passed the Harlem way. An outsider tested the order. The order held. No blood, no chaos. The lesson mattered more than the details. Bumpy walked his usual route that morning. Same pace, same posture. He didn't look for acknowledgement, but it found him anyway. A vendor handed him an apple without charge. A preacher tipped his hat, eyes steady. These weren't rewards. They were confirmations. The community understood what had been protected. 8 witnesses carried their part of the responsibility. Each knew what to say and what to leave unsaid. They understood that legacy wasn't built on spectacle, but on consistency. The story would travel because it needed to, not because anyone pushed it. The Navy man didn't return. That was noted too. Not with mockery, but with acceptance. Harlem wasn't interested in humiliating outsiders. It was interested in teaching them where they stood. The absence was proof enough. Bumpy stopped outside a storefront and watched a boy struggle to lift a crate. He stepped in, adjusted the angle, showed him how to carry weight without hurting himself. The boy nodded, grateful, and went on. That was the real work. Moments like that didn't make stories, but they made men. Later, in a quiet room, Bumpy sat alone and considered the shape of things. Power came and went. Reputation faded if it wasn't fed by action. He knew that one night didn't secure anything. Only the next right decision did. Only restraint repeated over time became authority. He thought of the insult fight a real man It lingered not as an offense, but as a misunderstanding corrected. Real men didn't rush toward violence. They stood still long enough to let it pass. They protected what mattered and accepted the burden that came with it. Harlem continued to hum. Disputes arose and were settled. Doors stayed open. Lines stayed clear. The balance held because it was tended, not because it was feared. Years later, the story would surface again, usually quietly, usually at the end of another lesson. 8 witnesses would remember the way the room felt, the way inevitability sounded like calm. They would remember a man who didn't need to prove himself, because his life already had. Bumpy Johnson's legacy wasn't carved in trophies or headlines. It lived in the absence of violence where violence was expected. It lived in the steady confidence of a neighborhood that knew who it belonged to. That night passed into memory the right way, unadorned, accurate, useful, and Harlem stood.